So one of the things that occurred to me as we were listening to Sally Beebe and Sabella is how multifaceted this thing is. Unitarian Universalism, and maybe religion in general, that we're concerned, our area of concern includes racism and changing the scope and trajectory of the political and socioeconomic reality. It also includes worship. It includes very personal things such as domestic violence and caring for our sick elders. So, people ask you, what is UU about? And the only answer really is, how long do you have to talk? So, Building a New Way was the theme of the month, or the theme of the GA. And that was mostly apparent in the fact that we sang Building a New Way after every worship, or during every worship at some point. For me, the GA was sort of high-pointed by three different phases. One of which was Ministry Days, which takes place just prior to GA, and it's the gathering of all the ministers, and we have our own sort of GA, and talk about ourselves mostly, but how to do ministry and how to be ministers, and what the future of that looks like, and what the past looked like too. And included in that was the opening service, which was, well, you'll have to wait until next week actually to hear about that. Let's just say I've thought a lot about it. And it has caused me to reconsider some things. And I invite you back next week to hear about that. So I'm going to skip a little bit through that opening phase. The three phases are opening service and ministry days. And then the service of the living tradition, which was another worship service. And then finally the Ware Lecture, which was presented by Cornel West this year. Probably the leading African-American intellectual in America, in the world. Ministry days. What I'm bringing back to you from ministry days, there was a lot of talk about leading with your vulnerability. Right? So, and this applies, of course, to me as your minister, but I think it also applies to you, as we believe in the priesthood of all believers, so to speak, which means that you are all ministers. Long ago, we did the exercise of everyone who's a minister in the room, raise your hand. All hands should be up. So this applies to you. Lead with your vulnerability. Not that vulnerability is the goal. It's a starting point. It's a starting point. Vulnerability, leading with your vulnerability leads to freedom, leads to humility, because we start to deal with our weaknesses, and through that, because weaknesses are scary, we're forced to come up against them courageously, not be hooked by that fear, which of course plays very nicely into my personal definition of salvation, which is the freedom of being hooked by fear. So I think there's freedom in vulnerability, in starting with vulnerability. Also, there's this real tension in amongst the ministers, a friendly tension, a beloved tension of old and new, of the older generation and the new generation of ministers. And this can be broadly conceptualized as sort of a humanist versus spiritually oriented set of folk. So, I saw worship that was led by people who were very much on the spiritual side of things. And in fact, I think there's a little bit of overshoot going on. Yeah. There's a little bit of overshoot going on, and I'm a little bit concerned about that. And that's that conversation is also happening. I'm about to drink something green. If I get it on my mustache, let me know. Good? Okay. So there's some overshoot even amongst the ministry, there was some hand raising and stuff like this to songs and whatnot, which makes me personally feel a little uncomfortable. It feels inauthentic to me. That is a dangerous thing to say, because who am I to say what your authenticity is? But I'm not sure that's the direction that I am headed in as a minister. Now, on the other hand, so like I said, there's overshoot. But I think what they're trying to do, the people who are very interested in the spiritual side of things, is make the conversation broader. Of course, that's being met at this point with some resistance from the humanists as they feel a bit squeezed out. So the goal, my personal goal, is to try to embrace the human, not even as we expand the conversation, make sure the humanists feel included. And I know some of you who are humanists don't feel I've done a very good job of that. So I will lead with my vulnerability, and we could all have a conversation on how to make that conversation broad and not let you feel squeezed out or left behind. But it's got to be this inclusive thing. We can't be pigeonholed in either of those camps. All right, which then comes into, actually that flows very well into the Service of the Living Tradition sermon, which was presented by the Reverend Marlon Levenhar, who is fantastic. I mean, yeah, fantastic. Yeah, we'll invite him here. Okay, we'll do that. Why not? Sure. So he led with a poem by Langston Hughes, which I will read snippets of. It's a rather long poem. We don't have time for all of it. I encourage you to read it. It begins, "Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me." Continuing, it says, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been, yet and yet must be. The land where every man is free." Goes on and finally closes with, "Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft, of stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plant, the rivers, the mountains and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green states, and make America again." To me, so much of the General Assembly was captured in this poem. We've got all the claims to justice, the economic justice, the racial justice, and all the tentacles that flow out of those things, the environmental justice. And he moved from that into making the claim that not only has America never been America to African Americans, but that Unitarian Universalism has never really been Unitarian Universalism to Unitarian Universalists. That in fact, these are both ideals which are yet to be seen in reality. He tells a story about his daughter who had died at the age of 3. And he relates how he asked parishioners who were nearing the end of their own lives, quite close, that should they see her on the other side, right? He's asking this of theists and of humanists. He's asking this of the whole spectrum of belief. But he says, if you see her, let her know that her father and her mother still love her. And of course, they all happily agree to do that. And he says that there is something in the humanity of a sincere request of a broken-hearted father combined with that impending mortality that allows us to let go of our literalism. If they had held on to their literalism, many of them would not have had the opportunity to share that tender moment, that expansive moment. And so he says, we bathe together in the deep longing and tenderness that begs such a request. says that's a place that is sacred, that is beyond belief. And that's the place that we are aspiring to occupy, to embody, is a sacred place beyond belief. And the concern is that we actually, even in our proclaimed openness, do in fact have tests of belief. We don't have a creed, but if somebody were to come to you and say that they spoke in tongues, or that they read the Bible every night before they went to bed, would that person feel comfortable in many UU churches? He says, I don't think we will ever grow if our churches are places where people have to be spiritually closeted. So the good news here for us, I think, is that we are actually ahead of the curve on this. We have a wide variety of theologies and beliefs and perspectives that I think are shared fairly openly in this congregation. So I want to congratulate you for creating a sanctuary that allows that to take place, and challenge you to continue to do so. See, Reverend Levin Haar was afraid that if we come here to a church hiding our deepest fears and longings, then we're not really a church. And that those deepest fears and longings take the shape of many vocabularies of the Spirit. He says that if coming to church means putting on a Sunday face and hiding our vulnerability and putting on a facade of self-reliance, this is great. He says, well then, pardon me, Mr. Emerson, but that is not a church I want to go to. So the challenge that he lays before us is that if we had something important about ourselves that we are hesitant to tell each other, to imagine that if we had the courage to voice those important things about ourselves and find that we were still embraced and loved and respected, it would be incredibly healing to ourselves and freeing to others to do the same. So I found that to be quite moving. Getting back to the America, make America, America again, he noted that Unitarian Universalism is a remarkable development in religious history. And in fact, that means it's a remarkable development in human history. We occupy some very rare space. However, our responsibility is such that if we can't be who we say that we are, who else is going to do it? And so therefore, that if we can't be who we say we are, then America will never be able to be what America thinks it is. So that is our responsibility. He wants us to let you be you again. The faith that it never was and yet still can be. The Ware lecture was on the last evening of GA, and it was brought to us by Cornel West, who was an incredible speaker and a lightning rod that generates his own weather systems. And frankly, in some ways, it was a little disappointing. He did not challenge us, even as much as BB did today. We've got to take BB's challenge very seriously. He noted some things that we could feel as a challenge if we were to get around it. But I wanted to be more challenged. I wanted a little bit more fire and brimstone. And he did bring some wisdom, right? that we could see as a challenge. He, referring to W.E. Du Bois, and by the way, this is a great line. He said, piety is listening to those who have come before you. That's the real piety. I thought that was quite lovely and powerful. And from there, he launched into his reflections on W.E. Du Bois and 4 questions that W.E. Du Bois asked in a novel towards the end of his life. And the questions are these. Now, the trick is that he didn't really answer the questions. Did he answer these questions not directly? He told some stories afterwards, but the questions are still powerful enough that I think we could let them resonate with us. How does integrity face oppression? In other words, can you sacrifice your popularity in the name of something bigger than you, that being truth and justice? How does integrity face oppression? What does honesty do in the face of deception? And here he held up Brother Snowden. Thank God for Brother Snowden, he said. What does decency do in the case of insult? And is an insult to others an insult to us? What do we do in the case of insult? What does decency do in the case of insult? And how does virtue, finally the last question, how does virtue meet brute force? Because at the end of the day, that is going to happen. In fact, that happened at the beginning of the day, and it's happening now. There is brute force being applied to people in our country. How does virtue meet that? And for me, it takes us back to humility and vulnerability being, again, the starting point to saving or adjusting our world. Embracing humility and vulnerability leads to freedom from fear because it acknowledges fear, faces it, does not get hooked by it, doesn't deny it. Embracing and starting with humility and vulnerability, by the way, is countercultural. Do you see many culture heroes with these qualities currently in our society? Vulnerability and humility? Because I don't. And so what that means is that in a culture based on resume writing and survival of the fittest, where weaknesses and flaws are viewed as sin rather than opportunities for self-improvement, humility and vulnerability are subversive to the powers that be, because they are subversive to the structure upon which those powers are based. So when we enter into an allyship with Black Lives Matter, we do so with humility and vulnerability. So we are building a new way. Martin Levenhar says that what we need is a coming out in this association. An association that is championing that language of coming out for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and trans folk. Now can adopt that same language and have a coming out in terms of embracing all that we are. Not humanists, not spiritualists, but something that contains all of them. Building a place where people are not afraid to be who they are, truly. A place where whoever you are, you know that you are embraced by a love beyond belief, and that you are a vessel of love beyond belief. Our religion, claims Marlon Levenhar, will be saved by people revealing their truth and welcoming the truth of others.